the dispossession is part of it. But, there's this really fascinating study out of India about political violence. And so the number one thing for political violence in India is when they did it with with expenditure records. So as Muslims, the marginalized group, get more money to spend compared to Hindus, that's when the violence starts, right? And this can be seen everywhere. Well, exactly. Because what's actually happening is in America, you have Black people and Latino people moving up, and you have economically, politically, America's about to become a majority minority country by 2040. And as that happens, the overclass essentially reacts with violence. And you can see that everywhere. You can see that in India. You can see it all over Africa. You can see it in Asia. You can see it in the Middle East, certainly. So, that is, to me, if you're asking what the deeper process is underway, the psychological process, that would be right at the top of the list. In fact, there's an amazing study that came out about the January 6th insurrectionists, and only about 20% of them were from the militias. But the huge overwhelming factor was that they all came from counties where exactly that thing had happened, where exactly that phenomenon
I saw that, where they came from counties that had been becoming more diverse relatively recently.
And it's amazing because it's not them becoming poor, right? It's not like them becoming. It's not them losing. It's the people below them gaining in relation to them that causes the violence, which is even worse. I mean, it is even darker.
This week on the Forward podcast, the author of The Next Civil War, Stephen Marche, joins me with his vision of what's to come in the U.S. Is a breakup inevitable? This week on Forward. It is my pleasure to welcome to the Forward podcast, author of The Next Civil War, which I have in my hot little hands, Stephen Marche. Welcome, Stephen.
Hi, Andrew. Pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you. So first, what the heck prompted you to write this very, very dramatic book, which I enjoyed a great deal? And two, how has the reception been since you've been out there touring and promoting?
Well, the reception's been great. I'll answer your second question first. The reception's been great. I mean, it's been a bit odd because I've sort of been on all kinds of media, like left-wing media, right-wing media, and they're so different, and they have such different takes on this stuff. And I mean, sometimes it's like it really is like coming from Canada. It's sort of like at one point, one of the right-wing groups asked me, like, would a civil war even be that bad a thing? And I was like, yeah, like South Carolina lost 25% of its male population, like 2.5% of the American population died in the first Civil War. Civil War is the worst thing that can happen to a country. I think it's probably worse than
you're not occupation. Praising the possibility of a civil war in this book.
Well, it never occurred to me. I mean, it literally never occurred to me that someone would suggest that a civil war might be a good thing. But so I wrote the book as a warning. Right, about how dangerous civil wars are and how close the United States was. And I mean, the real inspiration for it was I was sent by a Canadian magazine to cover the Trump inauguration.
What the heck do Canadians think is going on with us? They were like, you have to go tell us what's going on.
I was standing on top of a limousine at one point, and then the limousine was lit on fire. There was also like people handing out joints, but then it was that patchwork Washington, like it's illegal on federal land. So it's like, don't, here the joints are free. Over there, you could go to jail for them. Like there was quite a lot of chaos. And then in the middle of the night, like 2-3 in the morning, a fellow journalist from Canada called me and said, we're going to a party. And I said, okay. If he told me to, I was going to. It was in Georgetown, and it was like a low-level guy at the USDA. And, the kind of guy who's responsible for wheat in 2050. Or whatever, the bureaucrats that keep us all alive. And he'd taken all the presidential photos with him, and he'd taken his chair from the office. And I said, what's going on? And he said, no one came to replace me today. Like we turned off the lights at the U.S. Department of Agriculture today. And I was like, okay, this is very serious. Like it's time to really go in deep over the next like all other projects are going to be put on hold. We're just going to look at what is going wrong in America and how badly it's going wrong. And the book is really the answer to that question, which is, unfortunately pretty bad.
So this was a political appointee who just went home and everyone just shrugged.
Well, ordinarily, if ordinarily for every other president that's ever been elected in history, that team would have been established 2 years ago, right? Like they would have known who would have taken that job like a million years earlier, right? And somebody would have come and taken over their papers, and that would have been it. And like, unlike, Canada or Britain or other parliamentary democracies where there's a really stable civil service that in effect runs the country and the politicians kind of come and try and move that ship around a bit, like it was like there's no one there, right? And that really, and of course, like that became really clear during the Trump years with the State Department, especially, where I think in the end only about a third of positions were ever even filled.
Yeah, they were trying to starve the State Department for whatever reason. It was a very odd approach to diplomacy. So this is January 2017, right? The inauguration?
That's right. Yeah.
And so you write the article about the inauguration and you go back to your editors or whomever and say, hey guys, I think the US is heading towards deep shit approaching and I want to write. Did it start out as a book? Was it articles? Like what was the next step?
It was an article. And they said, I said, I want to write about this. I think a civil war is coming. Well, I did some research first. Like I went to a gun show in Tulsa and then I went to Ohio for the Guardian and hung out with some Oath Keepers. And I was interviewing Nazis and I was interviewing far right people, hard right people, and, just meeting them and like trying to get a feel from the ground of what this is like, what the reality is here.
Were they welcoming to the Canadian journalists? Were they into it, or did you feel?
Oh,
unsafe?
if you look like me, they're the sweetest guys in the world. I mean, they're like it's definitely I get along very well with white supremacists and with hard right people. They're perfectly pleasant, and I mean that makes them much scarier, right? Like these are not people with "Born to Lose" tattooed on their chest. These are like teachers and people who run small businesses and like and they just happen to like walking around armed and don't believe in the validity of the federal authority, right? And I think it's also they're much more educated than I would have believed. Like you go and it's very scary when you go to talk to someone and they're like and you're like, well, how are you going to build this white ethno state in the Pacific Northwest? And they're like, oh, well, we'll model it on Japan's constitution. And they have a whole system for it. And they have law degrees and they know what they're doing. So that also scared me. And then I did that sort of grounding research. And then I really began to look into the models, the hyperpartisanship models, the environmental models, the research, which is at a really high point right now. I mean, I will say like the book, one of the reasons you can write a book like this is because the modeling for a lot of these things has gotten to the point where it's just excellent because of the quality of the data. And then I went to my editors and said, yeah, I think a civil war is coming. I'd like to write about it. And they said, you've got to be out of your mind. Yeah, there's no way that's going to happen. And I said, really? I think they said you're being totally alarmist.
I beg to differ, editor. Like I think it's coming.
I was like, look, I mean, let me write it and then we'll go from there. And then that's what happened.
Okay, listen up. 90% of the coffee from the grocery store is actually stale. So you heard that right. The coffee you know and think you love needs an upgrade. So instead of rebuying the same old, let Trade Coffee send you something freshly roasted that you're literally guaranteed to love. So here's the deal. Trade sells the freshest roasted and ethically sourced beans from America's best independent roasters. They ship to you for free as often as you like, whole or ground, however you like it. So whether you're a coffee nerd or you just want a better daily cup, Trade's real coffee experts taste test over 400 roasts and use tech to match you with your ideal coffee based on your preferences and brewing methods. So for me, you just take this quick quiz, whether you like it dark or light, or you like it in a K-cup, or you like it ground, and then they ship it to you based on what you've matched with, and it's awesome. So you can take this quick quiz And then Trade Coffee guarantees you will love your first bag or they'll replace it for free. So they've been featured in the press by Wired and GQ and have delivered over 5 million bags of coffee. Like, these guys are legit. There's no hassle. You can skip your shipments. You can change your frequency. You cancel at any time. This stuff, if you love coffee, is a better way to get awesome coffee. And for our listeners, right now, Trade Coffee is offering a total of $20 off your first 3 bags. It's pretty great. So that's if you go to drinktrade.com/yang. So to get started, take their quiz at drinktrade.com/yang and start your journey to the perfect cup. That's drinktrade.com/yang for $20 off your first 3 bags. Check it out.
Among the modeling and research that you dug into, was Peter Turchin's model among them, where he has this political stress index? He's out of the University of Connecticut, I believe, and it shows for him in their model, which includes a lot of different factors, including lack of opportunity for educated elites, nutrition, like a bunch of different factors go into it. But his study showed political stress to be at literally Civil War levels, which is one of the reasons why I take this possibility very seriously.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, the fact that there's like Barbara Walters' books that uses a completely separate methodology from mine, but comes to the exact same conclusions. I mean, that's a bit of a warning, right? Like, you could, I didn't go through that model, although I was familiar with it. I went through PRIO, the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, because I felt they had a sort of like a slightly more it wouldn't be fair to say more global, but like they were not in America, right? And part of the thing that I wanted was to get like perspectives outside of America on America, because I find like the debate in America is so toxic that it kind of consumes, like everyone gets consumed within it. And so, yeah, I mean, that's excellent research though. But you know, the models that I used are more specifically tied to inequality, and those vertical inequality and horizontal inequality, both, which are, you know, literally at levels that the Republic has never seen before. Like, there's never been higher inequality. Back in 1776, there was not this level of inequality.
Yeah, we're in the new strange Gilded Age, supercharged by technology and capitalism in different ways. So when you talk about horizontal inequality versus vertical inequality, explain. I have a sense that vertical inequality is the inequality that most people think of.
Well, inequality is like, they're high level. There are some people who are very rich and there are some people who are very poor. America, of course, is the real extreme example of this globally, where it's off the charts. Like, it's the Gini coefficient is just so crazy in the United States that it basically breaks all the models. Horizontal inequality is inequality between groups. So inequality between ethnic groups, between different regions, between different identifiable groups, and both are very high in the United States. And both, you know, are predictors of civil war. I mean, you know, like, some people ask me what are the most common things that lead into it. You know, the anocracy is probably the biggest one, but I don't really like to think of it that way, because to me, it's a complex cascading system. It's something where everything feeds into itself, and that's why you get such turbulence, right? Like that's why the unimaginable keeps happening all the time. Like, why it's like you just can't believe something happened, because
I think a lot of Americans have had that sense. It's like, oh, I can't believe that's happening, but now it's almost commonplace. So you just used a term, anocracy. Can you explain?
Like, societies that are ripe for civil war and for political violence generally are not democracies or autocracies. Those are both very stable. Like, there's not going to be a revolution in Russia. It's an autocracy. There's not going to be a revolution in Canada, God willing, although God knows we've come close twice to losing the country in my lifetime. But and there was martial law declared just before I was born. But you know, those kind of societies tend not to have lots of political violence. It's where you're in this in-between space.
The gray area, like the fake democracy, the democracy that no one has actual faith in.
Exactly. And that, I mean, America is that now, I think. And
I agree.
It is. Yeah.
We very much resemble a fake democracy for reasons that like I'm very animated about.
I think like one of the things about you is that the right's always kind of made that argument. Like the right has always sort of said like they're not legitimate, but now it's people on the left and people with data and people with not emotions but out of reason saying, this is not a functioning system anymore.
Some of the reasons why I think America has become a fake democracy is that you have this two-party system that is very rigidly enforced. And now 83 to 90% of congressional races are gerrymandered to be safely blue or safely red, so that there's no real uncertainty around which party is going to emerge from that seat victorious. To the extent that any uncertainty exists is in the primary, which ends up distorting incentives in various ways. But it does mean that if you're in the minority party in 90% of the country, you might as well just not vote or sit it out. And so when people go and exhort you to be like, oh, get involved, do this, it's like, we've actually set it up so that you can have no meaningful impact on this race, but we're going to inflame you. We're going to make you mad in various ways. So this system, I think, is very, very discouraging to many, many Americans. It's not a genuine democracy in that if you did have like an independent actor or party or candidate, the odds of them actually being able to make headway are vanishingly low, because you would need $10 million to run a statewide campaign. Like, what independent could have that? If you're an ordinary citizen, you're on the outside looking in, so you get told, look, you have to play within these parties, which, by the way, again, aren't really open unto themselves. You have this strange media landscape that's hyperpolarized and gutted at the local level. So those are some of the things I think about when I think fake democracy, which is a different argument than the stuff that you've heard from, let's say, the right in times past.
No, that's true. I mean, to me, as an outsider, like the inherent fairness of any electoral system is kind of not really relevant, because what matters is that people feel the system to be legitimate. I mean, that's the basis of peaceful government. Like we have a first past the post system here, which, has definite, you could like sometimes the majority party wins with 39% of the vote. Right. And everyone's, sort of outraged. But then, this is just the system.
But your system is designed that way. I mean, how many political parties are active in Canada?
3. Well, more. There's at least 4, actually. But sometimes one is currently a minority government, with the third party being the kingmaker, really, right now, the NDP. But my point really is that that's all fine and good until ordinary people, like, you can survive all of that until ordinary people start to feel that their system is not representing the popular will. And I mean, the evidence is really becoming clear that is happening, that ordinary Americans don't feel that their electoral system represents the popular will. And as you for all the reasons you just said, that's a perfectly rational point of view to hold. Right. And, and the other thing is it's about to get much worse. It's about to get much dramatically worse.
So you embark on this journey in 2017. You're doing research. Yeah. And I had the same experience twice, actually. When I wrote my book, The War on Normal People, I had a thesis around the fact that automation was going to transform the economy in ways that were going to push many Americans to the side. And when I was doing that research, it was much, much more garish and frightening than I'd ever imagined when I started the process.
I know. It's funny, isn't it, where you're like, oh, yeah. Well, you're like, well, I mean, am I right? And then you go and you're like, oh, it's like, as bad as it looks on the surface, it's much worse underneath. I mean, for sure.
Yeah. And your book has a number of snapshots from the future that feel true to life, that they feel like they very well could happen or will happen. The first of them I found to be really enthralling or fascinating is what you call the Battle of the Bridge. And it did feel like it could be ripped from the headlines. Can you explain the fact pattern and the research you did that led you to use this as an example of a catalyst that could send the U.S. towards some kind of political violence?
Sure. Well, there are a lot of right-wing groups that hate the federal government, and they're quite sizable, but they're also quite chaotic, and they're ideologically chaotic, and they're organizationally chaotic. That doesn't mean they're weak. It means that there's just a huge fragmented number of them, and like sometimes, and they go back and forth between them. So there's like QAnon people, and then there's Second Amendment fundamentalists, and then there's tax. People who don't believe that they should pay any tax, and then there's sovereign citizens, and then there's sagebrush rebels, where it's about federal land. So I wanted to imagine a scenario that would unite them, like we saw in Charlottesville. And the figure that seemed to me most dangerous was the constitutional sheriffs, because they have authority. They are elected. There's no question that they're a democratic representative, and there's a large group of them who really believe that in the doctrine of interposition, even though it's been roundly rejected by the Supreme Court and every other court, that the role of a sheriff is to resist federal authority. And they kind of love this, and it's a big macho scene, really, is what it is. And so I just imagined the right coalescing around a sheriff who suddenly decided to not to resist the federal authority. And, in that case, the government would have to respond. It would not be a question where it's like, well, what are we going to, they would have to respond. And then you get into, the military planning for what they call full spectrum operations in the homeland, and the extreme legal quagmire that would result from trying to occupy an American county.
And so the hypothetical you drew, which I thought was really smart, was that the feds want to shut down a bridge for repairs, and it would greatly inconvenience the local community because they won't have a bridge for a certain period of time. So the sheriff says, screw that, we're going to keep this bridge open. And so then you wind up with a bunch of anti-government types saying, freedom, keep the bridge open. And then the feds having to play the heavies, the bad guys being like, no, we're going to shut this bridge down. Now, the bridge could have structural problems, but it works today. So, it's not like the bridge is crumbling before everyone's eyes. And so for the average person on the ground, they're like, why are you shutting this bridge down?
Well, yeah, but I mean, like, it is a bit like COVID. Right, where you have like the experts are on one side, and ordinary people don't want to do it because it's extremely annoying, right? But like there are a lot of bridges in America that no one should be driving over, a lot, and the infrastructure is at a really staggeringly, unacceptable point. But yeah, the reason I took a bridge is because that exact thing happened in the 80s in Arizona, and I just talked to the guy who did it. With this book, I really tried to stay it's a work of imagination in a way. Like, I'm imagining these scenarios, but I literally made sure that everything could be footnoted, and that there was an analog to all of it, so that this is not about. It
felt very grounded in reality. I'm either happy or unhappy to say.
I worked, like, if there was an example from history that I could take, I just took it, right? I didn't mess around. It's just like, we'll just use what's there and go from there. Because also the other thing is, you don't need to frighten people. Like, you don't need to make stuff up to be scary with this stuff. Like, if you tell the basic facts, they're plenty scary enough.
Yeah, I agree. So let's play out the scenario as you did in the book, just so people have a sense as to how this might play out. So you have a bunch of far-right groups show up on the bridge saying, free country, defend the bridge, the sheriff's a hero, and the sheriff's doing interviews on various radio shows and cable TV being lauded. And then half the country says this guy's a kook. This guy's not like anti-law enforcement, not actually law enforcement. This interposition thing is garbage. And then eventually you have the U.S. military encircling this bridge saying, what are we going to do? You have hundreds of activists on the bridge partying all night. You have most reasonable Americans looking at this saying, well, I certainly don't agree with what the heck is going on that bridge, but I don't know if I agree with shooting and killing the people on the bridge, though the people on the bridge are, in this case, heavily armed with automatic weapons and the rest of it. And so that's the scenario you draw out. And if you're most Americans, you think, well, what you'd want would be a peaceful resolution of this standoff. But if a peaceful resolution is not in the offing and bloodshed does take place, you can very easily imagine the sheriff and others being hailed as martyrs in some quarters, a lot of reasonable Americans looking at it and saying, oh my gosh, like dozens of people died. You can see you can imagine the images on social media that would be playing day and night.
Well, like January 6th happened. Those guys are in a prison in Washington and they sing the national anthem every night because they consider themselves political prisoners, right? Like they consider themselves political prisoners. And many do as well. So the first thing in the book that I assumed, which January 6th, I think, showed pretty clearly.
And you wrote this book before January 6th. When the January 6th happens, you're like, oh, wow. I had to throw in a chapter.
Right? Like I'd already written that, but it just happened. So it's no longer a prediction. So I had to throw out a chapter. But, what happened was like immediately within hours, the media narrative diverged, right? Like within hours, you have Rush Limbaugh saying, I'm glad the men at Concord used guns when they had to, and I'm glad that they weren't opposed to revolution. And then you have the left being like, this is an assault on democracy. It immediately bifurcates into these media networks. The political people respond to that automatically. January 6th is horrible, but January 6th happens to a lot of countries. Right, like we had to declare martial law in 1970 in Canada. All European countries have had similar. Like this is not something unknown to history. But what is really shocking to me was the members of Congress not showing up to give a minute of silence for the police officer who was slain on Congress, defending their physical security, like literally fighting for their lives and dying, and they do not have the collective narrative sensibility to get together to mourn this man. So that's the level of the narrative divide. Right, where like it just splits. Then, of course, in the book, you have a question of, well, the military is really in an impossible position, not tactically. The Marines are, nobody can go up against the Marines. The Marines are tough. They are not losing to anyone. Never mind a bunch of militiamen who are with AR-15s and so on. Like they would. I talked to many military experts, and I was like, well, give me a battle scene. Like, give me a scene where there's engagement. They were like, there's no engagement. We just walk over them.
By walk over them, you mean kill them?
Yeah. Like in terms of an engagement, like it's an NBA team against your local Sunday night pickup game. It is professionals with every attribute in their side. Technological, like they just walk. There's nothing to describe. Like that's what they told me. So, but that doesn't really matter because America has learned about counterinsurgency through 70 years of failure. Like there's no, like when you win, you still lose, right? And the legal nightmare of trying to wage war against people who are your fellow citizens, especially in America, because of the nature of the Constitution.
If you were to have U.S. citizens killed on American soil by the armed forces, it would be a nightmare, and it would inflame tens of millions of Americans.
Exactly.
Very, very directly.
Yeah. And I mean, given that, even an assault on the Capitol gets split into factions really quickly, like imagine what that would do. Well, I mean, I did imagine it. The problem with counterinsurgency that they learned over and over again is that the attempts to stop violence inflame violence over and over again, right? And it's certainly, I have no reason to think that would not happen in the United States, which is with intense concepts of freedom, really messianic, impossible concepts of freedom, in this space.
One thing you mention is that there are many elements of the armed forces that are kind of aligned with conservative belief, and some of these are sympathetic to some of the far right groups. That it's not like if you lined up the armed forces, they're evenly split between different political ideologies. And I know there are different people that are concerned at various levels that you would have a split among the armed forces themselves. You might have certain armed forces members who want to sit it out or who have no interest in taking arms against their fellow Americans who they feel are standing up for what is right.
Well, no one knows how any military would react, but I mean, I would say, like, for example, in Arkansas in the 50s, when they had to send in the military, and that's still, other than 1992, the LA riots, that's still the foremost legal example of sending in U.S. troops into the U.S. They did order Arkansas soldiers to barracks, right? Like they did not use them in the field. I mean, we have a pretty good sense of the infiltration of hard right militias into police forces, which is quite extensive and hugely troubling. But the stuff about the military is much weaker. Like that's not like they don't. There's no there's the Military Times asked people, have you seen white power insignia? And there was a huge number of people who said that. And there are other evidence that there's obviously white power things in the military, but we don't know how extensive they are. The other thing is that the military oath, unlike virtually every other U.S. institution, has held up incredibly well. I think that if the military oath goes and they don't follow command, the country really is over. That's the end. But I actually don't think that will fall. I think the chain of command is so strong, and the understanding of the oath in the military is, at least from the people that I talk to, and also, you could see this during the Trump years where even pro-Trump generals and so on were, basically not going to have any part of this nonsense. I'm less worried about the military than I am about police forces, if I can put it that way.
Interestingly enough, Americans trust the military more than they trust just about any other institution. At this point, it's not like, oh, we love our political leaders, and it's like, oh, then the military is lower on the totem pole. Actually, the military is at the top of the food chain in terms of American trust.
The military is very worried about it. I mean, like the senior people I spoke to talked about a monopoly of trust. That's not what the military is supposed to do. The military is a tool that the civilian people are supposed to use. And that they are not intended to be political animals. They're not intended to solve internal political. They're the worst possible people to do, and they know it. They're absolutely conscious of that, right? Like the military does not exist to dictate anything about civilian power structures. In fact, it requires really strong civilian power structures to function, to do its basic functions. So, I mean, they're openly talking about what horrible position they're increasingly being put in, because they are the only national institution that really has massive amounts of trust from the American people, and that alone is a very, very dangerous fact. Now, military coups, that's the least likely scenario for America, for me. I think that's really marginal. Like, it's not. I mean, nothing's impossible in this world, but that's really highly unlikely.
Because you have this military professional culture that makes them unlikely to try and usurp political control.
They don't want the power, for one thing, but also, the number one predictor of a coup is that you have a history of coups, and America has no history of coups, right? It has a history of assassination that's extensive. It has a lengthy history of political violence. It has history of occupation. It has a history of civil war. But there are not coups, right? This is the most enduring democracy ever. Right. So, that seems to me pretty unlikely.
Your book also includes a scenario around a president being assassinated. And there was a statistic that blew my mind that said something like 1 out of every 11 presidents has been assassinated. And that assassination is something of a pattern in American life. Should have told me that before I ran for president, Stephen.
Well, I'm sure they told you right after, right? I mean, like I'm sure the guys that came to protect you. Did you? I mean, what was that like? Did you have your own security, or did they come to you?
So the way it works in politics is that you get Secret Service protection after you become the nominee of a major party, which I never did.
Right.
So I fell short of getting Secret Service details.
Right.
There were various threats against me at different times, and different law enforcement people were notified. So there was some interaction with law enforcement trying to make sure I was safe. So some people just didn't like the idea of everyone having money. We're like, oh, that free money guy, get him.
Well, I mean, I have to say, like, I had a friend who ran for alderwoman in Hudson Valley, and she got death threats, right? Like, I mean, increasingly death threats are for, like, certainly as a journalist, like, you don't know how many have I gotten after publishing this book? At least half a dozen, right? I mean, obviously it's much more serious for you. It's like it's a real possibility, but the normalization of threats.
It's one reason why a lot of Republican members of Congress were reluctant to impeach Trump or
Right.
to have a commission around January 6th, because they got death threats. And they looked at it and said, you know what, like, is this that important to me?
Is democracy that important? I mean, I have so little sympathy for that, I must say. I mean, like, when I
have
think
a
about
little bit more sympathy, Stephen, because because when they go to their town hall or their airport or whatever, and then they have a crazy person screaming at them and whatnot, threatening their family, they get their dozen death threats. Like a lot of these members of Congress are not properly protected, in my opinion. They have nothing.
Right.
They have nothing close to what you'd imagine as Secret Service protection, and so they back down. I don't think it's right, but I suppose I'm more sympathetic, maybe because I know some of the people involved who've either put up with it and walked through it and seen all of the fire they had to walk through. I mean, it just did not seem easy.
I get that. Like, I truly understand what you're talking about, but my grandfather had to fly in the back of a bomber and drop bombs over Hamburg for democracy. The democracy has always required quite a bit of sacrifice from people. It seems like, and the stakes are real. The stakes are democracy in America, right? That is what is at play.
I'm imagining what they're talking themselves into is like, look, these are my constituents. This is the way they feel. I'm elected to represent them. And if they think that this was a legitimate political expression and not,
Wow.
and I mean, I'm just imagining that some of the
I mean,
kind of
quit and get a regular job. Is that's not the hardest thing in the world to me. Like, that's not an unwarranted sacrifice for
you do have a ton of people retiring. I think last number I saw you have at this point, I believe, over 20 members of Congress who are saying I'm out. And some of it is because of what we're talking about right now. And I also know a host of people who were considering running for office who are like, I'm not going to run for office given the madness.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, that's part of the breakdown, right? I mean, when I talked about the complex cascading system, like, it is that's why crazy things keep happening. It's like, well, the violence leads to, it's not necessarily what you see, it's what you don't see. It's like the people who don't run, the people who don't enter politics, and then that feeds into bad decision making, which leads to worse outcomes, which leads to more insanity, right? Like, that's how this feedback loop kind of works, right? And it's broken.
Your book did make me think that we've gone a while without an assassination.
Well, Secret Service are amazing. Like, I would not. It would be a total fluke if there were to be a presidential assassination. I mean, a lot of things would have to go wrong. Now, a lot of things do go wrong. In the book, it's not hard to imagine how it would happen. But the Secret Service are the best. Like, they are extremely, extremely good at what they do. I think a group, like if a militia decided to send out an assassin to kill the president, they wouldn't have a chance, in my opinion. Like they would not be able to do that. It'd be more like stochastic terrorism, which is, increasingly what they face and what they can't control at all, because it's just rage. It's just random internet generated rage, that radicalizes itself and finds its own methods. And that's of course, who can predict that?
Yeah, and that's the scenario you play out in the book, where there's an unlikely series of events, but if you have a multitude of people big enough, then the unlikely event actually becomes much more plausible and possible. If you had, like you're describing, millions of Americans who'd been radicalized or enraged in a particular way. Another scenario you play out in the book is climate change and its effect on both our ability to sustain cities, like the city I'm sitting in right now, New York City, and crop yields and a bunch of other things. And you played it out over a series of years. But that was very scary stuff.
I couldn't sleep often when I was writing that.
Yeah, and it seemed, unfortunately, very, very real and almost upon us.
I mean, those are definitely, I use the best available models for everything in this book. So, but some are stronger than others, right? Like economic models are incredibly weak. Like they just don't hold up, and they don't have falsifiability, and they don't have a great track record. The environmental models are basically not
pretty good.
They are unbelievably reliable. So the guy I'm talking to about New York, like, he's a reinsurer. He's like the lead thinker of a reinsurance company. $1 trillion bets are placed on his opinion of this stuff, right? And
they're good if people are betting hundreds of billions of dollars on the veracity of the model.
Yeah, and I mean, there are two reinsurance events that they can't really reinsure for. One is massive hurricanes hitting New York, and the other is a true devastation of Tokyo. Right, those are the ones where the size of the devastation, you can't hedge out. Like you essentially can't. There's no market big enough to bet against that. Yeah, I mean, it's very, very terrifying, because New York, unlike Miami's a great town and Houston's a great town, but New York is New York, right? Like, it is the center of the world, and it has 88% of the world's foreign currency transactions take place through it, and information. It is the hub of global information networks, at least for the West, and it's extremely vulnerable. The Trump administration canceled the seawall, which I find shocking. Not a lot of things shock me in this, and then the other guy was the guy about corn at the USDA, and just a nice guy who wants to talk about corn, and it's so scary. Like, it's so scary talking to that guy about the future of food, because, our entire civilization is based on the cheap, abundant, staple crops produced by the Midwest, and the incredible innovative capacity of the American farmer, which is astonishing. And they're entering an innovation trap where they effectively don't know what to innovate to. And so, and they don't know how to, the moisture variability is fluctuating in such a way that they can't plan. Like, they're brilliant at planning, but they can't really plan around these high levels of variability at different stages of the season. So, yeah, thinking about what life would be like if food were no longer cheap, really, really, really frightening.
It was scary stuff.
Yeah.
One of the things that I found most helpful about this book is you did something I'd never seen before, which is you defined civil war according to, I believe, the Oslo Peace Institute's definition, which was 1,000 people dying per year of political violence.
Yeah, combatant
deaths. Yeah. And right now, America has something like 25 to 50 such deaths on an annual basis, which would qualify us as what was the term? It was like
civil strife.
So civil strife is already here in the U.S., and civil war would be if that went up something like 20 to 40 times. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, these definitions are like I'm trying to like these are the best definitions I could find. I'm not 100%.
It's the best definition I've seen, man, because like you
Yeah,
see hyperbole around this all the time. You're like, oh,
yeah,
civil war. I mean, I've used it myself. I've been like, is a civil war in the U.S. a
right.
possibility? And I've been saying yes for a while, but I did not know that what qualifies it, according to at least experts, is 1,000 combatant deaths in a given year.
Yeah, I mean, there are also problems with defining like what a combatant death is in this case. So, like, I
Sure.
mean, first of all, the U.S. is so heterogeneous and so enormous that like the question is, are these definitions super meaningful? I mean, I think they are in a way because they show. Okay, we're not at civil war yet. We're at civil strife. It's these numbers, but like all the numbers of combatant deaths, like those are taken from journalists and like people at research institutes like ADL and Southern Poverty Law Center who go through newspaper reports and then define them as political violence. Because for the police and for the FBI, that's not necessarily a meaningful category. Like when Jared Miller went in Vegas and shot 2 police officers and put a note saying the revolution has started because he's a member of the sovereign citizen group. For the police, he's just a lunatic, right? And so, like, it's up to other people to define the nature of political violence, and that's why some people even argue there is no political violence in the United States.
Well, I mean, that seems impossible now. I mean, because we just saw Jan 6 and people died. So, I mean, that has to qualify.
Well, I mean, it doesn't have to qualify. Like you could define that in any number of ways. Part of the problem is defining the line between criminality, mental illness, and political extremism is blurry. At the best of times, and certainly in other countries, it's very difficult to see. But I don't think. Like, I think the point, we all know that political violence is growing and that you can see it. And like, as you say, January 6th, like, yeah, that's political violence to me. When a sovereign citizen kills some police officers because they don't think the federal authority is legitimate, that to me is political violence, even if they have a history of mental illness. But there are different. Yeah, I mean, there are different ways of cutting it up. But the point I think really is that it's what we were talking about before is like, people running for office feel threatened. Mobs are going to election officials to intimidate them. That's political violence. I mean, I just don't think there's any way around saying that's what it is. And it's definitely on the rise.
It is tough to differentiate, in part because, and I've been making this case, where you have a society where a lot of people, let's say men in particular, are struggling with a loss of meaning, a loss of purpose, structure, fulfillment, community. And then they fall prey to these toxic ideologies, being like, hey, you know why your life isn't going the way you want? These people or these structures, and they become radicalized, like the young man in your book, where Hugh's at home and then he starts going down the internet rabbit hole. And you end up finding meaning in ideas that at least have some political association. A lot of it is tied together with the disintegration of American men is one of the points I'm making. And I agree. It'd be tough to kind of draw a line between someone being mentally ill and someone being criminally violent and someone being politically motivated. So in my mind, if there's any hint of them having a political purpose, I personally would throw them in that category because I think the factors are all tied together.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like. I try to tease them out in the book and separate them, but they're all of a piece, right? Like they're all.
Yeah.
It's the dismal tide, as Cormac McCarthy put it. Like, I mean, I would say that there's like I remember talking to a central banker. Well, not the central banker, but one of the a banker in the United States, and we were talking about it, and I was like, well, why doesn't this happen elsewhere? Like, why doesn't this happen in Europe? And why doesn't this happen in Canada? And so he was like, well, he said, you don't have an army of the dispossessed.
You don't have 400 million firearms, enough for every man, woman, and child.
Yeah. But he said, there are a lot of people in America who have nothing. Like, if you're in Canada and you have nothing, you still have healthcare and education.
Wait, this Stephen, this is a good national motto or slogan. In Canada, if you have nothing, you still have something. Come to Canada.
Well, if you see a homeless guy on the street, and there's plenty of homeless in Toronto, but you know that guy gets all the medical care, that he gets the same medical care as you, right? Like that's a big difference, right? Like that's a big difference in what you, and of course it creates a different relationship to the state, completely different relationship to solidarity in the state, right? But I mean, the other thing is, like, to me, the dispossession is part of it. But there's this really fascinating study out of India about political violence. And so the number one thing for political violence in India is when they did it with with expenditure records. So as Muslims, the marginalized group, get more money to spend compared to Hindus, that's when the violence starts, right? And this can be seen everywhere. Well, exactly, because like what's actually happening is in America you have Black people and Latino people moving up, and you have economically, politically, America's about to become a majority minority country by 2040. And as that happens, the overclass essentially reacts with violence. And you can see that everywhere. You can see that in India. You can see it all over Africa. You can see it in Asia. You can see it in the Middle East, certainly. So, that is, to me, if you're asking what the deeper process is underway, the psychological process, that would be right at the top of the list. In fact, there's an amazing study that came out about the January 6th insurrectionists, and only about 20% of them were from the militias. But the huge overwhelming factor was that they all came from counties where exactly that thing had happened, where exactly that phenomenon
I saw
had happened.
that, where they came from counties that had been becoming more diverse relatively recently.
And it's amazing because it's not them becoming poor, right? It's not like them becoming. It's not them losing. It's the people below them gaining in relation to them that causes the violence, which is even worse. I mean, like, it is even darker.
Yes. So when you've been talking the book, and you mentioned before that a conservative actually framed it as like, is civil war so bad? Which is a very, very dark reaction. What was the reaction from the left? And so here's at least my thinking on it, is that when people talk about this civil war, we think that the active threat is from the far right, which, by the way, I agree with. I mean, like, there are a number of reasons for this. And so I'm curious whether folks on the left take this threat very, very seriously or are dismissive of it because they're kind of institutionalists.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can probably speak to this. I know you can speak to this better than me, because I don't understand why so many, like the Chuck Schumers of this world and the Joe Bidens of this world, are not, like, how there was any debate about the filibuster at all is just totally beyond me, right? Like, it's like this system is but I think the only explanation I can come up for their political reaction is that they're so invested in these institutions that they can't really accept them collapsing. And of course, as a foreigner, when you talk to Americans, they worship their institutions. They've been taught from childhood that this is the greatest political system in the history of the world. It's the answer to history, effectively. Like, who was it? The guy with the big mustache who was the big hawk in the Iraq war. What was his name? I mean, he said what we should have done as Iraq is go in and throw in the Federalist Papers and say, figure it out. Right. And just the assumption of the superiority of the American system above all, I think, is extremely hard to shake, especially when you're 80. Right. Like it's extremely hard to shake it when you've lived your whole life in that legacy, which is, of course, a very glorious legacy. I mean, I'm not denying that it isn't. It just happens to be broken. Right. So, I think that's but you can probably answer that better than me. The people on the left that I've talked to, my experience has been they're starting to wake up that really basic things like democracy are at stake. And it's probably, things like fighting over Dave Chappelle might have to be sidelined for a while. The struggle now is clearly over institutions and what they should look like, rather than, the kind of cultural politics that have sort of dominated the left for 10 years now.
Well, if there is a wake-up call, you're one of the people making it. And I think one of the things that you may run into that I can vouch for is that at this point, many Democrats have become kind of the voices and the defenders of the fading establishment and the fading institutions. And then the Republicans have been overtaken by this anti-institutionalist zeal. And when you say something like, hey, maybe these institutions are having problems, some Democrats take it as a partisan attack, which is certainly not the intent. It's like, hey, I kind of want you to not screw up or I want your stuff to work, or I just want American society to work. But unfortunately, in a polarized environment, they'll take anything that questions their prized institutions as something that's partisan or political. Because conservatives generally will take this narrative that you're saying and be like, oh yeah, this is happening.
Well, exactly. Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, the genre of Civil War science fiction, that's all conservative, right? There's a vast genre of like imagined civil wars, like Texas separating and sending F-15s to bomb, Oklahoma. Like there's like a whole genre of that, all conservative, right? But I think the left, because it's starting to stare them right in the face. Like Biden could not get his diplomats, nominated for a year, right? Like these are basic tasks of government, right? Very basic tasks of government, like guaranteeing your debt. Like they're playing really dangerous games with national debt.
It makes no sense to anyone else
like, it's
outside
bizarre.
the country. They'd be like, this is totally
it's just
bizarre.
It's like it's like, why on earth would you do that? But also, like, well, as we said before, there was nobody showed up at the USDA. Like nobody was minding the store. That's what scared me.
Most Americans have no idea that happened or didn't happen.
Right. Well, but I think like it's pretty clear it isn't working. Right. Like like
amen.
And I think increasingly when like one of the things is that like Americans barely even talk about policy anymore. Right. Because like to talk about policy would be to imply that you have a government that could enact a policy. And there is no government that can enact a policy. So instead, there's Make America Great Again or socialism, right? Which the meaning of socialism when it comes out of an American politician's mouth is unrelated to what socialism means anywhere else in the world.
Oh,
right?
Take it from me. I know what you're talking about.
Like completely. Well, I remember because the 2015 Canadian election had ended, and I went to a Trump-Sanders rally for The Guardian to report the next day. And I left Canada, and the Canadian elections are like, sir, we need to spend $26.8 million on education. No, you're completely wrong. We need to increase that budget to $32.8 million. It's all numbers and boring, and nobody watches, and it's just totally banal and boring because it's all policy. It's all like actual debates around policies, right?
That's my kind of debate.
Right. You'd feel right at home.
I should move to Canada.
Yeah, the Forward Party in Canada. See how it goes, But like you go to America, and it's like God and socialism. And there's no numbers. No one brings up any numbers because, it would actually be meaningless to talk about numbers, because look at Biden. He controls the Senate and the House, and he still can't pass, what in effect is a budget, right? So, like, I think people are starting to figure out that, like, America's entered a post-policy phase. Essentially, it has become ungovernable, and that's unsustainable.
Well, enjoyed your book a great deal. I think it's important that people understand that you can be talking about these matters like the next Civil War and do it not from a conservative or a liberal perspective, but just from a perspective of fact, reason, data, and study. Again, appreciate your work. Love the book. And thank you so much, Stephen, for writing it and for sounding the alarm.
Always great to talk to you, Andrew.